Well, day two of Prime Minister Modi's landmark state visit began with an elaborate ceremonial welcome on the south lawns of the White House, a grand spectacle that saw scores of excited Indian Americans cheering the Prime Minister on. President Biden said India and the US are two great nations, friends and powers that share democratic values, and India-US ties will define the 21st century. The two leaders then held talks on a range of bilateral and global issues. What followed were some big-ticket announcements. The one area that has seen the biggest breakthroughs and path-breaking deals is that of defense ties and technology cooperation. American giant GE and India's Hindustan Aeronautics Limited have signed an MOU to jointly produce fighter jet engines for the Indian Air Force, with significant transfer of technology. It's being termed a game changer and a trailblazing initiative, as this is the first time that the US is sharing such technology with a non-ally. Let me begin by asking you, now during the ceremonial welcome for Prime Minister Modi, President Biden said India and the US are two great nations, friends and powers that share democratic values, and the India-US relationship will define the 21st century. While a lot of these state visits are high on optics and rhetoric, but it is being said that this one is truly epoch-making. Do you believe that what we are now witnessing truly signals the cementing of a defining partnership?
I would agree with that. I think that this really is a historical visit. And as you said, it's been very strong on the symbolism. A state visit, a 21-gun salute, addressing the joint session of Congress, multiple standing ovations by the U.S. congressional members while he's making his speech. But also, as you say, the substance is strong. You look at the progress that the two sides have announced, whether it's on technology. And, I want to make the point that the U.S. and India have long been talking about technology, but this is different. What we see with the initiative on critical and emerging technologies, which was launched by the two leaders over a year ago. Of course, there was a meeting of the national security advisors in January. And now with these very significant announcements where the US company Micron is going to be investing in a semiconductor testing facility in India. We're going to see US and India cooperating on 5G technologies, most specifically the open radio access network technologies, cutting edge technologies, not to mention that the US has agreed that the two countries will co-produce jet engines. I can't overstate what a big deal this is, that the US is sharing this very sensitive technology. Only a few countries in the world have this technology. And this will assist India in enhancing its own defense production capabilities and meeting the challenges from China. So yes, I agree. This was a historical visit, and particularly following a year when the two countries have not seen eye to eye on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They have had their differences, but what they're doing is they're setting aside those differences. They're saying this partnership is too important, and they're ready to invest in it. They're ready to take it to the next level. So yeah, I think it's quite a historical day.
It is indeed. Let's now dwell on some specifics. You just referred to the deal for the joint manufacture of GE F414 fighter jet engines. What makes it truly significant is, of course, the transfer of technology that comes with it. India, in fact, has called it a trailblazing initiative. Like you said, this is the first time that the US is sharing such sensitive technology with a non-ally, and of course, very few countries have it. They call it the crown jewel of their defense production, and that is the reason why many believe this is going to be a game changer for India's armed forces and most certainly for the India-US relationship. Do you believe that despite all the reservations and differences Washington may have had on India's stand on the Russia-Ukraine war, India's long-standing relationship with Russia, the fact that it has decided to go this far actually is testament to how important the US does believe this relationship to be?
I think that's right. I think the Biden administration is demonstrating that despite, what may have been previous concerns about India's close ties to Russia, as well as its dependence on Russian military technology, the U.S. is still going to go that extra mile. It's going to make sure that India has the capabilities it needs, and it's going to take that leap of trust and faith in India and move forward with this, co-production deal. But let's also recognize that this is also part of an effort to see that India over time reduces its dependence on Russian military technology. This won't happen overnight, but we have to see this deal in that context as well.
Absolutely. There is no doubt the US is keen to wean India off its heavy dependence on Russian weapon supplies. And now that, it has decided to finally open the door of technology transfer, something that was up till now actually an irritant in the India-US relationship, does seem to be a big step forward in that direction. Now, Lisa, even as India maintains that it's not going to compromise on its strategic autonomy, there is all this talk about how India is a strong partner of the United States, but it is not an ally. It will not be an ally. Despite that, you call it a leap of faith, but even India now entering into such important historical deals with the United States, does this to you signal some sort of a shift on part of New Delhi vis-a-vis Moscow? Does it signal some degree of disengagement there, or would it be too early to draw those conclusions?
Well, I think it does show Indian confidence in the United States. For Prime Minister Modi to come here and make such a strong statement about the importance of the partnership and, use similar language that President Biden is using. When Prime Minister Modi tells the U.S. Congress that we're facing a darkening horizon of coercion and confrontation in the Indo-Pacific, he's talking about China. He doesn't use the word China, but we all know what he's talking about. So he's, speaking the same language as the United States and demonstrating that the United States and India have similar concerns. But I don't think that we need to read so much into it that we think India is going to suddenly give up on its relationship with Russia. That's not going to happen. The India-Russia relationship has long history. India still relies on about almost 50% of its defense imports from Russia. So again, that is...
And not to mention Russian oil.
Well, yes, but with the oil, India had not relied traditionally on Russian oil. It's only been since Russia's invasion of Ukraine that India has drastically stepped up its imports of Russian oil because it's taking advantage of the discounted prices. So I would say that is not something that has been part of the historical relationship between India and Russia. It's more India taking advantage of these discounted prices to benefit its own economy.
You're right about that. But, you talked about China and you do look at the Indo-Pacific very closely. So let's talk about that. You just referred to that speech the Prime Minister made in his address to the US Congress. He said the dark clouds of coercion and confrontation are casting their shadow in the Indo-Pacific. The stability of the region has become one of the central concerns of our partnership. We share a vision of a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific which is free from domination. So yes, there are clearly shared concerns between India and the US over China's growing aggression and revisionism. Do you think the US sees India as a countervailing force against China, or does that sound a bit far-fetched at this stage?
I think how the U.S. views India as an indispensable partner in asserting this vision of a free, open, resilient, transparent Indo-Pacific, that the U.S. cannot achieve that end state alone. It needs countries like India, India being a major democracy, the most populous nation in the world with an emerging economy, clearly is going to have a great deal of influence in this region. So the U.S. wants to partner with India with their like-minded goals. But again, India is not an ally. It's not an ally like Japan or Australia or the Philippines or South Korea is for the United States. So the expectation of India is slightly different, and it has more to do with India asserting its soft power, its economics, its people power, its cultural influence throughout the region. And the US wants to be associated with that. It wants to work hand in hand with India to make sure that this region remains free of coercion, that countries can maintain their sovereignty and independence. So that is really, I think, what the US is looking for from India when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region.
Right. Now, what we're discussing are very complex geopolitical equations. On the one hand, there seems to be this great power rivalry between the US and China. On the other hand, we know that their economies are also intertwined. On the one hand, there is this strong, robust and long-standing relationship that New Delhi enjoys with Moscow, which, as you said, is not going to end anytime soon. But at the same time, Lisa, do you believe that Moscow's growing proximity to Beijing is something that New Delhi could become increasingly uncomfortable with and could make New Delhi somewhat wary of Moscow going forward? Does that, in a sense, also somehow fit into these evolving dynamics that we see between all these nations?
Yes, I think India already is concerned about the growing closeness between Russia and China. We saw the announcement of the No Limits partnership just, weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine. And, we do see more coordination, collaboration between Russia and China. So India already is concerned about that. But I think India is trying to make a wedge between the two countries and feels, that it wants to keep its ties with Russia in an effort to try to keep that wedge. But I think this is going to be more and more difficult for India moving forward, because as Russia becomes more and more isolated, as the sanctions start to bite the Russian economy, Russia is going to be more dependent on China, and will have to do China's bidding. So I don't think that India will be able to rely on Russia, particularly if there is another India-China border crisis, like which we had in 2020. In that case, India did turn to Russia, but things are different now. The power dynamics are changing. And in those changing power dynamics, Russia is getting weaker and weaker. And I think that means that India really has to assess what is in its own national security interest moving forward, and what is going to help it protect its own borders and its own maritime space, maintaining free and open seaways, particularly in the Indian Ocean region. And India is going to have to make these decisions and calculations on its own. The U.S. is not going to be conditioning its relationship with India on India's decisions. But I do think that it is something that Indian leaders have to consider moving forward. Will they be able to rely on Russia as they have in the past? Or are they going to have to look at how the new geostrategic situation is shaping up?
That is interesting. You are saying that Russia's growing isolation is something that could hurt India's interests, and therefore it may have to, in fact, review its relationship with Moscow going forward. Now, keeping the focus on China for the moment, we saw U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken visiting Beijing over the weekend. The two sides agreed to continue to talk to each other, and soon after that, you had President Biden calling Xi Jinping a dictator. No surprises that China reacted very angrily, calling the remarks irresponsible and a violation of diplomatic protocol. Firstly, I wonder what you made of President Biden's remarks, and he was asked whether he regretted making it, and he said, not quite. And at the same time, do you think that India might want some sort of clarity from Washington on how it really plans to take things forward with Beijing?
Well, I think that from the U.S. perspective, it wants to keep lines of communication open with China. It doesn't want this increasing competition to devolve into conflict. And so on the one hand, the U.S. is enhancing its own capabilities. That's why we had the CHIPS Act, the $50 billion in investment in U.S. technology companies. That's why we have the U.S. investing in its allies and partners in the region with its Indo-Pacific strategy. It's preparing for this competition with China, but it doesn't want that competition to devolve into conflict. And so that's why the U.S. is, on the one hand, preparing and working on deterrence, and on the other hand, keeping a hand open to China and trying to seek dialogue and cooperation on particularly, issues that they might have converging interests: climate change, nuclear non-proliferation, some of these global issues that they might be able to talk about. So I think that is how the U.S. Strategy or position toward China should be understood. And I think India has some similar approaches. India has a major trading relationship with China, and that it seems to be growing, even as there continue to be tensions on the India-China border, military tensions. So I think, India should understand what the U.S. is doing with its nuanced policy toward China, because in many ways, India has the same kind of nuanced policy. And so I think, again, together, India and the U.S. working together on deterrence and partnering more closely on, all of the issues that we've been talking about: technology, defense, trade, space. That really is the best way to help deter an aggressive China and try to help ensure that the Indo-Pacific region remains free and open and free from Chinese coercion and confrontation.
Well, you're right. Diplomacy and foreign relations do not take place in black or white. The area is always gray, and that is how all countries operate. At the end of the day, it is really about their interest over and above everything else. Let's talk about Pakistan. Prime Minister Modi, without naming Pakistan, said in his address to the US Congress that even 2 decades after 9/11 and a decade after 26/11, terrorism remains a pressing challenge, and there can be no ifs and buts in dealing with it. Now, we know, Lisa, in the past there's been a great deal of heartburn for India over close military ties between the US and Pakistan, particularly if you cite the example of, let's say, America providing F-16s to Pakistan. But do you believe that equation has changed significantly in the last couple of years since the withdrawal of the US and NATO troops from Afghanistan? How do you see that equation? Because it has been a huge irritant for India.
Well, certainly the U.S.-Pakistan relationship has changed dramatically, especially since the U.S. withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. The U.S. is not reliant on Pakistan for ground lines of communication to, resupply its troops. So it really does not have that kind of intense relationship, counterterrorism partnership that it had for many years with Pakistan. But really, the relationship has been deteriorating for a while, even before the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, over Pakistan's support for the Taliban. So, there is no question that the U.S. has prioritized India in its foreign policy, and that it's looking to India in terms of bringing peace and stability to the region. So, Pakistan, the U.S., will not want to see Pakistan, melt down, will not want to see, chaos and political instability there. And so the U.S. will try to reach out to Pakistan, try to ensure it remains stable. But at the same time, there's no denying that the U.S. Strategic priority is India and that relationship. So this has been happening, I think, for many, many years, but it seems to be, crystal clear now that the U.S. is prioritizing its relationship with India.
Okay, Lisa, I know that you have to leave, so I will just ask you one final question. An interview that has gone viral is of former US President Barack Obama in conversation with CNN, where he says, if I had a conversation with Prime Minister Modi, I would argue that if you do not protect the rights of minorities in India, there's a strong possibility that at some point India starts pulling apart. He suggests then that President Biden should take this up with Prime Minister Modi. Now, you can understand that this has caused anger in some sections here in India. And then there are those who say that President Biden seems to have actually taken a far more pragmatic approach on this issue. We also saw this coming up in that press conference that the two leaders addressed after their bilateral talks. How do you think the US actually sees this issue of press freedom and religious freedoms in India?
Well, this came up at the press conference, and I think Prime Minister Modi handled it very well. He made the point that India is a democracy, that it runs in its veins democratic ideals. He pointed to the Indian Constitution, and we know that the Indian Constitution has protections of religious minorities in it. This is one of the wonderful things about India. If you know about the development of its constitution in the 1950s, there was priority given to protecting minorities in India and a desire to see a secular, multi-religious country, and realizing that the definition of a democracy is a country that goes out of its way to protect its religious minorities. And I think, President Biden also acknowledged these foundations of Indian democracy, and he acknowledged that the world looks to both India and the United States to be models of democracy. Now, of course, both countries are imperfect democracies. I think the U.S. has to come at these issues with a certain amount of humility. But at the same time, it only makes sense that our two countries would engage in discussions about democracy and the importance of playing that leadership role for the rest of the world in demonstrating pluralistic democracy works, and that it's important that democracies protect their religious minorities.
Right, and I think we can all agree that no democracy is perfect. All democracies are works in progress. On that note, Lisa Curtis, thank you so much for speaking to us. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.